Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Transparency and Consent Framework, version 2.0. I am Noelle Shitashi, Director for Privacy and Public Policy at IAB Europe, and I will be your host today. There is an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout this webinar using the webinar control panel. I encourage you to submit your questions as you come up with them, and our speakers will cover them during the dedicated Q&A session at the end of this webinar. With me today are members of IAB Europe and key contributors to shaping the TCF version 2.0, Matthias Matthiessen, Director of Privacy and Public Policy at IAB Europe. In a first step, Matthias will guide us through the history of the TCF, including why the TCF was created and who manages it. He will also provide valuable insight on how the TCF version 2.0 benefits all stakeholders, in particular CMPs and vendors. We also have Alice Lincoln, SVP of Data Policy and Governance at MediaMath. She'll cover the key changes of the policies, including the flexible vendor legal basis, publishers' increased controls, and improved support for legitimate interests. Stefan Branchelovic, brand safety manager at Group M. He will guide us through the modifications of the original data processing purposes and how these changes provide greater control. Jennifer Durkee, Director of PPA at IAB Tech Lab, will explain the technical specifications of the TCF version 2.0 and how the consent string operates. Patrick Burden will, our technical director at IAB Europe, will guide us through the importance of the CMP Validator and IAB Europe's TCF compliance program. And last but not least, Ari Beringer, Head of Products and Privacy at Quantcast, and David Dabbs, Senior Product Manager at Conversant, will lead the Q&A session together with Matthias. Matthias, take it away.
Thank you, Noelle. So let's jump straight into this overview of the TCF, the Transparency and Consent Framework, and talk about why it was created and who manages it. The TCF started development, or what would become the development of the TCF, actually back in Q1 2017. A few months after the GDPR had finally been adopted during this 2-year transition period. And we brought together the chief privacy officers, the privacy councils, and others from our member companies who needed to understand and implement changes in the companies to comply with the GDPR. And we started looking at the GDPR as a legal problem or a legal challenge. We realized at some point when looking at obligations around transparency and valid consent that technical changes would be necessary within the industry to be able to comply with some of these changes. And we started looking into how to solve these technical challenges. And we realized that as an industry that is so interconnected as is ours, compliance with these transparency and legal bases and accountability obligations of the GDPR are very difficult, if not impossible, to meet by individual players within the ecosystem. And by sort of virtue then needing a way to cooperate on compliance with these GDPR challenges, you needed standards. Because it would just be impossible or difficult to scale any proprietary solution to the point where you could easily rely on it, and we could make the whole process way more efficient by having a clear business standard. So let's take a quick look why the need for the TCF is there, and I would say it's really the need to disclose to users who is processing their data and for which purposes, which under the GDPR has to be much more robust. So the names of the individual controllers need to be known by the data subject at the time, or when it comes to consent, actually before consent has been given and processing starts. And secondly, each individual company processing data needs to be able to demonstrate that they are complying with legal obligations, such as disclosures having been made to users and consent having been given, which means it is just no longer good enough to rely on mere contracts to say, well, it should have happened. No, that's not good enough. You need to be able to say positively, it has happened. So when you look at our ecosystem, traditionally, sort of the website or app or smart toaster or anything that has a screen where ads are sold, where data is collected, and the background of the ad tech ecosystem have been disconnected when it came to privacy aspects like disclosure and managing choices. And so websites, while they used to have disclosures already, they really had no guarantee that they were disclosing the right information. You know, many of the ad tech vendors may be changing practices that require a different disclosure. And also, we didn't really have agreement about what it is that we were all doing. And in order to make a disclosure on behalf of several dozens of vendors, it is simply not possible for all of these several dozens of vendors to have different descriptions and different names for what they're doing when essentially those are very similar things. So standardization was necessary there. And then likewise, on the other end, these vendors need to know who is actually allowed to process data and do I have consent? Have I been disclosed? And without linking the two ends of the ecosystem, there's very little chance for each individual party to demonstrate compliance. So how does the TCF work? In a nutshell, ad tech companies or other vendors, measurement providers, anybody who is a third party in the internet ecosystem provides information to the global vendor list, which is a big registry where we ask for vendors to tell us their name, where to find their privacy policy, the purposes for which they're processing data, as we have standardized them, their legal bases, etc. This information being publicly available then can be used by CMPs who work for publishers to make disclosures that are accurate and that can be kept accurate too. Once the disclosure has been made, the signaling that we have created actually allows the CMP to offer choices to the user, but more than just offering the choices, actually encoding them in a standard way and passing them on into the ecosystem so that everybody can know whether or not they have been disclosed, whether or not there has been an objection, whether consent has been given in process, share data, process data, knowing much more than they did before. So my example here, the ad tech vendor in black was not disclosed to the user. So the signal shows that they do not have consent or a legitimate interest ground or transparency, and they know not to process because that's reflected in the signal, or the user here has actively deselected the ad tech vendor in pink, so that will be reflected in the signal. And not only do partners know not to share data with them necessarily, but also will the pink vendor know that they can process data. So some of the parts you have already seen here, that was the global vendor list. But there's really 4 different components to the TCF. And they're governed by different entities or governed decentrally. So the thing that everybody sees, and certainly everybody in Europe has seen already, is the user interface. And that is the only part of the framework that is not centrally managed, because it's managed by CMPs on behalf of publishers. And we're not getting in the way to determine what that has to look like. There's a lot of flexibility in determining the look and feel and the way that the user experience for the TCF works. However, there are minimum requirements that have to be met, which is why we have policies which are centrally managed by IAB Europe through its steering group. And we have the global vendor list, which is, as I explained already, where vendors sign up. And when they sign up, they tell us that they adhere to the TCF policies. So that publishers can trust that when they do send signals, those signals are respected. And then lastly, very importantly, the entire process that I've just outlined here is standardized through TCF technical specifications, which are managed by the IAB Tech Lab. And that is necessary because a standard means we all need to agree on the way we communicate. And the IAB Tech Lab is standardizing the ways of communication. So what are the benefits? For publishers, it's really a scalable and efficient way to ensure that the publishers' preferred technology partners have a GDPR legal basis and that they can demonstrate compliance, and therefore that publishers can transmit information about their users, but also provide transparency to their users about what is happening and have a much higher degree of trust that indeed what they are displaying to the users is what actually happens. They're supported in this by CMPs, of course. With the nice thing for CMPs is that there is a single sort of way of doing things, and there is by now 502 vendors who can just plug and play into this system. That is, of course, much more scale than I would imagine other proprietary standards might have. For vendors, I think the benefits are quite obvious, that they now have a way to be able to comply with these obligations, which do require cooperation with publishers. And so they benefit sort of from the same benefit that publishers have, in that they can have a way to lawfully process data. And advertisers, similarly to publishers, benefit from the possibility of making disclosures and managing consent, and having the vendors they rely on to reach their audience do so lawfully, or have a help in doing so lawfully. And not to forget the user, of course, the TCF provides more transparency and choice to users than we've seen before. So if we compare pre and post TCF choices, I think there is a quite significant improvement in the information that is being provided and the amount of control that users have about a vast amount of third parties that wasn't there before. So we've published the TCF version 2 for public comment on the 25th of April 2019, which is, by the way, the birthday of the TCF2, because we first went live with the TCF version 1 on the 25th of April 2018, a month before the GDPR would go live. And this comment period will last for 30 days, so to the 25th of May, or the anniversary of the GDPR. And we will then enter a transition period from version 1 to version 2, which we will provide a more detailed schedule of what that will look like after the specs have been finalized. But rest assured that there will be ample and reasonable time to make the necessary changes to become compliant with version 2 of the framework. And there will be a transition period during which you can use both. So very quickly on what the vendor focus is, and this is really just the topics that my colleagues are going to talk about. Some of the key changes really are new signals. I showed you the concept of the signals, and we used to have consent signals, but we have added many more new signals that are now transmitted through the TCF, one of them being new publisher controls that allow publishers to send preferences that vendors must comply with, in addition to user signals. We've added new explicit signals for supporting a vendor relying on a legitimate interest, knowing that they have achieved transparency, which is coupled to a signal that allows the user to send an objection to the processing of such, sort of the processing of data on the basis of a legitimate interest as well. And we've spent quite a significant amount of time as well on redefining the purposes, defining new purposes, and other standard defined definitions, features that users can receive disclosures about and make choices over. So overall, I think we will have even better informed users than under version 1. Users will have more control. And we obviously support a much broader swath of things that companies, that the industry needs under the GDPR than before. So it's quite a natural but very important improvement of the features that the TCF has as well. I think it's fair to say that the interests which are supported now also much more clearly take into account interests that we or opinions that we've heard from regulators, from publishers and advertisers who've participated in this process. Not that they didn't participate in the version 1 process, but we've had a much larger cross-section of the industry participate in the creation of version 2, which is why it took a little bit longer too. Anyway, without further delay, I'm handing this over to Alice to take you in more detail through the changes to the policies.
Thank you, Matthias. So there are 4 key changes to the TCF policies in version 2. There are flexible vendor legal bases, new controls for publishers, improved support for processing on the basis of legitimate interests, and changes to the purposes and features that are presented to users. And as Matthias mentions, I think it's important to stress again that these changes were implemented very thoughtfully over developed over a long period of time based on responses to feedback that we got from regulators, from publishers, advertisers, and ad tech intermediaries. It was an extremely collaborative effort, and always with an eye, first and foremost, for improving the user experience and helping to ensure that data subject rights are honored. So first off, I'd like to say a little bit more about flexible vendor legal bases. You may wonder why that's necessary or what that means. In version 1, a vendor could only register in the global vendor list with one legal basis per purpose. They declared either consent or legitimate interest for each purpose. And this was a challenge for vendors that may operate on a different legal basis for the same purpose in different contexts. So for example, a vendor might operate on one legal basis in certain countries and on another legal basis in another country based on a variety of different factors in the market. Or alternately, a vendor may prefer to operate on the basis of consent if the publisher is amenable, but be willing, if necessary, to operate perhaps on a more limited basis on the legal basis of legitimate interest, or vice versa. And so TCF version 2 allows the vendors to register with what we call flexible legal bases. So they can, for example, as you're seeing, still indicate just one, or for example, for purpose 2, they could say, we're willing to operate on the basis of consent or legitimate interest. And by default, we will do so on legitimate interest, i.e. if the publisher does not specify to us which basis, we'll operate on legitimate interest. By the same token, they could do the same in default to consent. So this is an important way that publishers can communicate their desires for how the vendor operates. Now, it's really important to note the publisher can't dictate to a vendor that they must operate on a legal basis that the vendor has not declared as possible. So the vendor is not obligated to operate on consent, for example, if the only legal basis for that purpose that they are willing to operate on is legitimate interests. And importantly, that information about the publisher choice will be communicated in the new TCF version 2 string. Where the publisher does indicate that it wishes to operate on a particular legal basis, the vendor is obligated to honor that choice. The second major policy change is providing additional publisher controls. So publisher in version 1 can choose the vendors with whom it wishes to work, and it can also choose which processing purposes it will allow. However, there was not in version 1 the concept of per vendor, per purpose control. This is something that publishers strongly wanted to see, and that we've incorporated in version 2 to give them more granular control than before. So, for example, a publisher may say it is fine for all vendors, which they've chosen, to process based on or process data for purposes 1, 2, and 4, but they may restrict processing for purpose 3 to only vendors X, Y, and Z, and for purposes 7 and 8 to vendors A, B, and C. And all of these, again, will be signaled in the updated TCF version 2 string, which contains a lot more detail than version 1. The third major policy area that changes in version 2 is improved support for legitimate interests. Vendors in version 1, for example, of the TCF, the right to object was signaled outside of the framework. And importantly, we've added this into version 2 as we think making that more easily available to users is an important capability. We've also added into this string a signal for vendors to know whether transparency has been provided by the publisher through their CMP to indicate that the vendor will be processing data on the basis of legitimate interest. So when the user comes to a publisher site, they will see the various purposes, the vendors, and there will be a distinction between processing based on consent and legitimate interest and the controls that users can exercise over both of those. Lastly, there was quite a lot of feedback in version 1, which was very instructive regarding the number and clarity of purposes and features. Version 2 of the TCF expands the number of purposes and features, standardizes them, and introduces a new concept called stacks. And for more on this particular aspect of the TCF, I'd like to hand it over to my good friend Stefan from Group M EMEA.
Thank you, Alice. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to present to you the product of the work that we have done in the past 10 to 11 months. This is, I'd actually like to reiterate what Matthias and Alice said, that this was really a cross-industry effort. So while the TCF version 1 had 5 purposes, Matthias, you can switch to the next slide, thank you, had 5 purposes which were standardized and three features. TCF version 2 presents new concepts beyond purposes and features, and those are special purposes, special features, and stacks. The TCF version 2 equally has standard names of purposes and stacks. It also presents standard language, legal and user-friendly, of purposes, special purposes, features, and special features, and also standard stack descriptions. IAB Europe will also produce standard translations of all these items that can be used across Europe in different countries that use different languages. What is important to stress here is that the language that always should be presented to users in order to give to provide vendors with legal certainty and clarity is the legal language of purposes, whereas user-friendly language is the optional one. This is up to a publisher and a CMP to decide which of these two they are going to present to users first, but the legal language should always be should always be presented. As you can see here, CMPs must use, without modification, the standardized purpose names, descriptions, or translations. Publishers may change stack descriptions under certain conditions, and I will explain in a bit what stacks are. And as always, purpose limitation applies. So vendors are limited to doing what is covered in the purposes for which they have permissions. This is something that we are stressing again because we have received a lot of questions on this. Even though the GDPR is very straightforward on this point, it is always worth mentioning it here again. So now I can tell you how purposes in version 1 are actually mapped to purposes in version 2. This is the moment where I'm supposed to remind you that there is no backwards compatibility between version 1 and version 2 purposes, which means that you will have to establish new legal basis for version 2 purposes. But the graph that you will just see here is supposed to just to clarify how different purposes actually correspond to each other, or what purposes in version 1 said and how it actually corresponds to purposes in the version 2. As I have mentioned, TCF version 1 purposes, there were 4. Information storage and access purpose. It is actually not a purpose in itself, it is rather a means for achieving other purposes. It is the e-privacy directive means or purpose, but for the purposes of TCF, we have decided to label this means as an actual purpose and signal it as such. Then you have also personalization, ad selection, delivery, and reporting, content selection, delivery, and reporting, and measurement. In the version 2, we have again purpose 1, which is not changing really. It is again e-privacy directive purpose or means to achieving other purposes, which is store and or access information on a device. The legal basis for this purpose is consent, with a slight caveat for those markets where e-privacy directive has been differently implemented. And then we have other 9 purposes over which users will actually have control. Those are, as you can see, create a personalized ads profile, create a personalized content profile. So as you can see, we have split advertising and content purposes. Then we have select basic ads, select personalized ads, and select personalized content. As for measurement purposes, the measurement purpose from version 1 has been split into 3, which is measure ad performance, measure content performance, and apply market research to generate audience insights, which is popularly known in our industry as audience research. The legal basis, vendors will be able to choose between consent and legitimate interest for these purposes. Therefore, users will be able to consent or to exercise their right to object to these purposes. I actually forgot to mention one more purpose, which is develop and improve products, which was added at the request of many of industry partners because they felt that there was a need to present additional transparency about the use of personal data for development and improvement of products. We also have so-called special purposes. So special purposes are purposes that are absolutely needed for our industry to function and deliver ads. Those are the purposes that, as I said, are absolutely needed, and therefore the legal basis for these purposes has been standardized at IAB level, and that legal basis is legitimate interest. These 2 purposes are ensure security, prevent fraud, and debug, and technically deliver ads or content. The difference between special purposes and purposes is that for regular purposes, users can exercise their choice through the TCF, meaning that they can actually give consent or withdraw their consent, or they can opt out from legitimate interest. Whereas for special purposes, the TCF will not give users that choice. Users will be able to exercise that choice by directly through vendors' portals. And then we have features. So many of you may wonder what features are. Features are actually either specific data points or data processing operations that are not unique to any of the purposes. So they can be used in the context of any of those 12 purposes that we have just seen. These in the version 1, we had 3 features, which were offline data matching, cross-device matching, and geolocation data. In the version 2, we have match and combine offline data sources, then link different devices, and you can see how they actually map to the version 1 features. And these are so-called regular features, whereas we will only disclose them to users, and users will not have choice over this. However, the group of the IAB Europe that was dealing with purposes and features decided to create 2 new special features. One is use precise geolocation data, and the second one is actively scan device characteristics for identification, or otherwise popularly known in our industry as active fingerprinting. As these 2 data processing operations or data points are extremely sensitive and they're not only sensitive for users, but they actually carry a large regulatory risk, the group has decided to give additional control to users and to increase transparency and control by allowing users to opt in to these features. How it actually works is that users will have a toggle that will say, do you allow these vendors to use your precise geolocation data for purposes listed below? For the exact language, you will have to go to the actual policy specifications of the TCF. If a user opts in and they say yes, and a vendor manages to also establish legal basis for other purposes, that special feature, that is to say use precise geolocation data, may be used in combination for other purposes for which a vendor has established appropriate legal basis. So that would be all about features. And finally, as you can see, we have created quite a lot of granular stacks, granular purposes, pardon. For that reason, we have decided to group these purposes and to present them to users in a more unified and in a clearer manner, therefore balancing between the need for granularity and the need for a good user experience. Stacks allow users to allow publishers and CMPs to present purposes within groups. And then if a publisher decides to use a stack, a user would be able to click on a stack, and in the next layer they would see purposes, and they would still be able to exercise their granular choice over purposes. This is an exclusively publisher choice, so publisher can decide to present granular purposes right away, all 10 of them, and special features, or they can decide to use stacks and give users a bigger picture of what is happening with their data. And then if users want to, they can dig one layer further in order to exercise their granular choice over purposes. So how a stack would look like, we have here on the screen. So we have 3 purposes, which are basic ads, personalized ads profile, show personalized ads, and ad measurement. So that's 4 purposes, which are combined then into a stack which is called personalized ads and ad measurement. This stack name is standardized, therefore it must be used in this manner by all publishers and CMPs. And then there is a stack description which describes all the purposes that are actually grouped in that particular stack. And here you can see that stack description for the stack personalized ads and ad measurement says that ads will be personalized based on a profile. More data will be added to better personalized ads, and ad performance will be measured. So if a publisher decides to present this stack, a user would come to a website. They would see personalized ads and ad measurement. They would be able to say, okay, I agree to this stack. Or if they would like to, they can click on the stack and actually exercise a choice over basic ads, personalized ads, show personalized ads, and ad measurement purpose separately. Having said that, I would like to stress that these purposes, as you can see them now, have been a product of a very, very long process. And what we try to do here is to meet requests from 4 sides, which are publishers. Publishers require certain granularity and more control. Users, even though the initial purposes of the TCF version 1 were drafted in the best possible fate, we understood that they were not really the most understandable piece. Therefore, we hope that these new purposes are going to be much more understandable. We also wanted to achieve that vendors know exactly what they can do under each one of the purposes, so that their respect of purpose limitation is made easier. And also, we had on our mind feedback that was received from different data protection regulatory authorities. So we are more than open for any constructive feedback, and hopefully we will receive some. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Jennifer Durkee. I'm with IAB Tech Lab. I'm going to talk today about the technical specifications. So as Matthias mentioned, we are able to provide development on an iteration on the technical underpinnings of the transparency consent framework. So the technical operations, the context is still the same. CMPs make the transparency consent string. User choice is still collected through the CMP offering with the user interface, and we learned about that just previously with the new purposes and the stacks. And user choice is still communicated. I'd also add that the vendor transparency is still communicated through the string itself, so that vendors can read the contents of that string and establish their transparency and understand the communicated user preferences. So let's dive into some of the changes in version 2 on the next slide. The global vendor list itself has been updated in version 2, the format of the global vendor list. The new version 2 global vendor list contents will be a global vendor list version, standard list of purposes, including any special purposes, the standard features, and any standard special features. So everything we had just learned about. The vendors will still have an assigned vendor ID and all of the information associated with that vendor, including their declared purposes for and legal bases of those purposes. The global vendor list version 2 will also contain vendor HTTP GET request limits. So we'll talk about that as well. On the next slide. One of the biggest changes in the technical specifications in version 2 is that we've changed from what was formerly known as the consent string is now known as the transparency and consent string. So we'll call it the TC string. We still have general metadata about the context of collecting consent. We still have the information about the user's consent, but we also, as my policy colleagues had hinted at, have a lot more information to communicate. So in the graph at the bottom, you'll see in blue everything that was also in the consent string in version 1. And in green, you'll see almost more than twice as much content in that string in version 2. So now we are including vendor legitimate interest allowed, purpose legitimate interest allowed. We'll communicate the publisher controls if publishers have disallowed anything that the vendor has registered for, and we'll also declare if there are custom stacks, as Stefan was just explaining. So you'll see that the transparency consent string has grown quite a bit to accommodate for a large increase in complexity and capabilities. The reason that we went towards this larger string is because we had a technical challenge of how to incorporate maximum flexibility for vendors and control for the publishers in version 2.0. These are some of the biggest areas of feedback that we had gotten since the V1. So we took a twofold approach. Part 1 is that the publisher vendor restrictions will be fully incorporated into the consent gathering process. So if anyone remembers, we had explored the idea of pub vendors. That is no more. There will not be a pub vendors external file. Instead, all of that will be in, and this is part 2, a combined transparency consent string. So on this slide, we're working through the idea of what the CMP workflow will look like. The CMP would estimate the transparency consent string size based on the publisher restrictions, which would be a process between the publisher and the CMP, would of course display that consent dialog to the user and then generate the transparency consent string recording a user's action. Of course, the CMP would still store the transparency consent string in a cookie or in local storage, and also make the transparency consent string available to downstream vendors. For vendors, still accessing the transparency consent string, if it's web inventory, either pinging the CMP JavaScript API or receiving the transparency consent string from another upstream vendor. For mobile app inventory, and we do still support mobile app inventory in version 2, the vendor can access the string via local storage, or again from any other upstream vendor that they interact with. Another notable development in version 2 is moving towards more consistent and more secure implementations. So in version 2, we do support a checksum, which would allow partners to understand if the transparency consent string is valid. That does not mean authenticated, but it does mean that parties will be able to tell if the transparency consent string is not truncated and it is complete and therefore valid. We are happy to accept any public comments. We'll show the email for those public comments, which the working group will review. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So hi everybody, my name's Patrick. I'm the Technical Director at IAB Europe, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the CMP Validator. Okay, so I just want to kick off by touching on the importance of a compliance checking tool. Now, I think everybody will agree that with a framework like the TCF, adherence to that framework is going to determine the outcome of success. Okay, so any departures from the policies of the framework or the technical specifications, those ultimately undermine trust in the framework itself. And moreover, in our case, this could lead to actual legal issues around GDPR, liability issues for publishers and or CMPs. Okay, so a key role for IAB Europe is to support the application of the framework, as this is essential for its success. For this reason, we've actually developed a tool called the CMP Validator, which will help CMPs and publishers adhere to the framework. Okay, so let me tell you a bit more about the validator. So what is the tool? Well, the tool gives us the ability to go and visit any website, any live website, and check the CMP implementation on that site. Now, the way we can do this is because the validator is built as a Chrome extension. And a Chrome extension is a browser extension which enhances the functionality of the browser. So that means we can browse to a site and test that site in situ and look at the CMP implementation there. So when we run the tool on a given site, the CMP validator checks the CMP implementation. It looks at the CMP API, which is mandated by the technical specification, and it makes sure that the API is operating as expected. It checks for the consent string, and it parses the consent string, and it makes sure that the content of the consent string can be read correctly. Based on this information that it analyzes, we then run a number of checks for common issues that we've seen within the industry. And so to give you an example of some of those issues, one case is where we see consent signals that are sent through the ad ecosystem before there's been affirmative action from the user. And that's clearly a bad use case because it's in breach of our policies, but more importantly, it's also a breach of GDPR. So not a good use case there. We also see quite a few CMPs that use a very old version of the global vendor list. Now, although CMPs do not need to reconsent users every time a global vendor list change is made, they do need to use the latest global vendor list when presenting the user interface. And that's in line with the policy, and that's why this is a compliance issue. So that's also important. We do see cases as well where we have invalid data in the consent string, an invalid CMP ID, for instance, where the ID might be 0 or 1. 0 or 1 is not an ID that's assigned to any CMP in the framework, and therefore it's invalid. Now, any of these compliance issues, we consider the consent string to be invalid if we find a compliance issue. So it's really very important for CMPs to fix these problems if they are present in their implementations. Now, the compliance issues that I've just talked about, we can check for automatically. There are a number of checks, for instance, to do with the user interface that we cannot check for automatically. So what we're looking to do in the future is implement some manual policy checks whereby a human can check that the correct information is being presented at the different layer of the user interface. Okay, so that gives you an overview. Now moving on to a couple of screenshots just to show you what the validator is looking like. So in this screenshot, we've browsed to a site and there's a little icon in the top right-hand corner of the browser, and when that's activated, the CMP validator is run. It checks the CMP implementation, and then it presents all the information it's found about the CMP installation. So in this case, you can just about see at the top there, it shows CMP name shown here. That would be the name of the CMP that we've identified, and it shows some information about the CMP API and the functions that are being accessed. So in effect, the validator is extracting information about the CMP implementation, and that information is being used to run those compliance checks. So moving on to another screenshot on the next slide, we can see in this case, we've got the problem with the CMP ID issue that's shown in the screenshot. So we've identified a consent string, but within the consent string, there's an incorrect CMP ID of 1, and that's clearly a problem and a compliance issue. Okay, so moving on. So on the next slide, we will talk about, so who will use the tool? So the tool is effectively an internal tool for the IAB, for IAB Europe, used for compliance checking. but we will also be making the tool available to registered CMPs and publishers so that they can self-check their implementations. Okay, moving on. And what we'll be doing with this tool, the tool will effectively help us kickstart a CMP compliance program. So what this will involve is that any new CMPs who register will have to go through those compliance checks before they're successfully admitted to the framework. And we will also be checking all existing CMPs for compliance. As well as the CMPs, we'll be looking at top sites in each European country to make sure those publisher sites are compliant. And if any issues are found, then we will give CMPs a fixed time period to resolve those issues. The target to roll out this compliance program at the moment is the end of May, and as soon as we're ready, we will be publishing the full details of that process to the community. And that's it from me. We'll move on now with the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
All right, here we are.
Okay, I'm gonna go through the questions. Maybe actually start at the most recent ones while Patrick's on the phone. We have a question about whether there will be a mobile app CMP validator.
Okay, that's a good question. It's a question that's come up before. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have plans to create a mobile version. And the reason for that is that the flexibility of the tool we have is dependent on it being a browser extension. But unfortunately, browser extensions do not operate on mobile Chrome browsers. So at this time, we won't be supporting mobile, but it's something we'll consider in the future.
Okay. How about here's one maybe for Matthias or whoops, sorry, they're moving. Will the CMP validator be available to ad tech companies? Patrick, I guess you said it will be available to publishers and CMPs. Will it be available to the vendors?
I don't see why not. I mean, we're going to be releasing it in a controlled fashion to CMPs and publishers if vendors want to get hold of it so that they can test the top end of the stream on the publisher site, then absolutely.
So one more question for you on the validator, Patrick. Sounds like the CMP validator is going to apply only to TCF version 1, or it does at the moment. Can you explain how that articulates with our announcement of version 2?
Yeah, very relevant question. So the validator that we will be releasing will be only analyzing version 1 currently. As soon as version 2 is in the market, we will be updating it so that it can actually validate version 2 TC strings as well.
Okay. How about as we're speaking of timing, when will vendors have to re-register their purposes to comply with version 2.0? Who wants to take that one? You want to take that one, Matthias?
I guess I can take it, and that's related to what I previously mentioned with respect to the timeline for transition to version 2. So after the 30 days public comment period has passed, we need to digest any comments that we receive and finalize both the technical specifications and the policies. And based on these final specifications and policies, we will be making updates to the global vendor list. And at some point, hopefully sometime in June, although the exact timeline will depend on how public comment goes as well, we will be able to open registrations for participation in version 2. However, as I have also explained, there will be a grace period before version 1 will be switched off. At some point, at the end of that grace period, we will be essentially sunsetting version 1. And once that has happened, everybody must have transitioned to version 2, and it is no longer possible at that point in time to rely on version 1 as a vendor or a CMP moving forward.
Okay, I have
exact details to be determined.
To be communicated. Is David Dabbs? I think David Dabbs is on. I have a sort of technical question. How can you explain how the TCF will be populated by the API to a DSP getting an add request from an SSP?
Okay, so presumably in this use case, the SSP has their technology integrated, their tags integrated on the publisher's site. They're going to be TCF aware. They're going to call the CMP API, obtain the consent string, pass it along up to their servers, and then the SSP will follow. Sometime last year, we published an addendum to the OpenRTB specification recommending two fields to add to the specification to pass along whether GDPR applies and the actual value of the consent string. So short answer is the SSP would pass along the consent string to the downstream DSP. That's how it would be. How it would be provided to them.
Thank you. I have a question on that applies to the technical specification, but I think it's a policy issue as well. Can you explain how? Can you explain on the out of band allowed OOB allowed bit in the technical specification? What's that about? What functionality does that confer?
David, would you mind if I just gave the policy context, and then if you could talk about the ideas for how to deal with that in the technical specs? I think that might be most helpful.
Sure.
So out of band means legal bases that have been established outside of the framework. Currently under version 1, the framework does not prohibit any participant from relying on lawful or legal bases for processing that have been established in compliance with the law outside of the framework. In future, the possibility to rely on out-of-band legal bases is subject to some additional conditions. That sort of naturally flows from the desire to give publishers a little bit more control, as the TCF is a way to work together. Sometimes, if we don't have any safeguards, it could lead to a situation where the TCF is intended to be used to exercise control, and then sort of unbeknownst to those using the TCF, something opposite happens because we don't put safeguards in. So in future, we're still not prohibiting the use of out-of-band legal bases in certain circumstances, but we do require that vendors who wish to rely on lawfully established out-of-band legal bases, that they're able to verify within the framework that the conditions for relying on out-of-band are met, which means we've outlined them in the policies. Some of the important ones are you can only rely on out-of-band legal bases where the scope of the legal bases that a publisher works with are global, not service specific. You must make sure that there isn't a more specific instruction to you as a vendor wanting to rely on out-of-band legal bases that have been established within the framework. So for example, what we want to avoid is the user refuses consent or objects to the processing by a vendor within the framework, and then that vendor processes data anyway, saying they have an out-of-band legal basis. So we wanted to make sure that we don't prohibit the use of out-of-band legal bases, but at the same time that isn't a way for vendors to avoid having to respect either publisher choices or user choices that the framework has been designed to give them. And David, if you wanted to talk about the considerations on how to signal the necessary information to vendors, I think that would also be great.
Sure, I can touch on that at a high level. So the in the specs provide, or the specs that are out for draft in an appendix describe our current thinking on the signaling for this out-of-band feature. and you can see more there. But where we're thinking it's not completely final, but we're finishing that in the public comment period. Just to underscore what Matthias said, the publisher can put their considerations into the string, as you saw reflected in that structure, by saying, I don't permit any use of out of band, or they can indicate anyone may utilize out of band legal bases, provided they've checked the signals in the string and they haven't already been constrained by some other signal. And finally, the publisher can, in addition, say that I permit the use of out-of-band legal bases, but only for these specific vendor participants in the framework. So they can apply a whitelist to the vendors that may engage in that sort of processing, provided they qualify. Hope that.
We had a question about, a couple questions about geolocation data. So one question, does latitude, longitude data truncated to 3 decimal places, does that qualify as precise geolocation data? That the scope of the precise geolocation data?
Yes.
Definition.
Actually, yeah. So 3 decimals still qualifies as precise geolocation data. The way we have defined it is geolocation data with an accuracy of up to 500 meters. So anything that is only accurate above 500 meters, so 501 meters, is not precise geolocation data, or 2 decimals of lat long information. So if you truncate to 2 decimals, then you're out of scope of the precise geolocation definition that we have created.
So there is a specific concern that a publisher may need to at least geo-target an IP address by country to find out if the user is from within the EEA. And that's like a practical consideration.
The only situation that may occur is, I don't know how large the Vatican City is. If it's under 500 meters, then it would no longer be possible to geo-target there. But I'm fairly certain that would be an extreme edge case to find a country that is so small that it would always be precise geolocation data. So country level precision is not precise enough to fall under our definition, unless you can find a country.
So here's a question about the position of the phenomenon of cookie storage. Is it true that the IAB domain is considered third party, meaning that CMPs it's not going to function on Safari and Firefox due to their technology limitations? ITP. Any comment on the TCF in that context?
David?
Sure. I mean, even without the external constraint of vendors like systems like ITP, there are going to be users who may turn off third-party cookies. They're very privacy conscious. So I don't remember if we have specific language treating it, but the CMP is going to need to store the transparency and consent signals obtained from the user somewhere. So if a third-party cookie is blocked, the CMP is sort of obliged to use that store that, say, in a first-party cookie, or in the case of an app, of course, it will always be in some sort of local storage. So the user's preferences will still be stored, and CMPs are, of course, going to have to take technology steps to set those cookies in a way that are not going to be disappear in a day or 7 days, apropos of ITP. And that will be something that the CMP will collaborate with their publisher on the best way to ensure that that's stored in a persistent manner.
It doesn't have to be cookies.
Correct. It could be local storage, right? We're not storing an advertising targeting identifier, which the industry is typically eschewed using local storage. We're storing information to make good on the user's privacy preferences. So that's a reasonable use of that technology.
Although it does affect relying on the implementation of what we refer to as global consent, right? The sharing of choices amongst CMPs relies on
Yes.
third-party cookies.
Yes,
Oh,
that's true. That's a side effect. If the CMP has to fall back to some sort of local storage, meaning a first-party cookie or actual local storage technology, then that consent string is then needs to be marked as service-specific, because it's essentially its scope of use is not global. It's specific to that service or site.
Cool.
I have a question about the special features and the consent as legal basis versus the opt-in for the special features. So what's the difference between specific consent choices for vendors and purposes versus opt-in choices with respect to the special features? Do consumers have to opt into special features specifically and separately from purposes and vendors?
Yes, it's a very good catch. I'm very pleased that that was found. The reason why it says opt-in and not consent is that in the TCF, legal bases, so consent or legitimate interest, are attached to purposes, and features are things that transcend purposes. They are a type of data processing activity or a data point that is used toward a purpose, right? You don't say, I would like to process your data for the reason or for the purpose of precise geolocation data, right? It's a means to an end. It's a means to achieve a purpose. So that's why it's not a purpose. And so as it has no legal basis requirement, but we sort of as a self-regulatory measure have decided to add an additional layer of user control to the use of these especially privacy impactful type of features. We needed a way to formulate how the user opts in that is different and not subject to the legal requirements of consent of the GDPR. That's why we're using the term opt-in. I think arguably it will be very similar, right? But maybe there might be some differences in future. Who knows? But I think to keep it simple, imagine it as though it was consent as well, but it isn't, strictly speaking.
I don't know if Ari's on, but I've had a couple questions about whether the TCF can be used to meet requirements laid down in the California Consumer Protection Act, the CCPA draft law.
We don't have Ari on.
Okay.
I think there have been conversations about whether one could look at the TCF to potentially solve some of the problems that other regulations other than the GDPR provide, although probably it would have to be an altered version of the TCF. The TCF, of course, has been developed with the GDPR in mind, which doesn't mean that we couldn't theoretically use some of its concepts in other contexts, but it would need some thinking about how that could be done, if it is at all helpful. And that would be for CCPA, it would be for our US colleagues to determine, to come together and decide, well, we do have something here. Can we maybe adapt that to suit our needs too?
So I have a question about whether it's possible to distinguish between when a user has declined or revoked consent versus not having been asked. Can you clarify?
Yeah,
those positions can be
maybe David can, because it's a question ultimately about the amount of information we can pack into the signals.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, the consent string that's stored in the global context will have some additional information in it in V2 to indicate which vendors have at some point been disclosed to the user. in that string, excuse me, so that, for instance, if you obtain a global consent string like this, and you see the consent bit for that particular vendor is false, but and the vendor has not been disclosed at any point, then you can consider that a null, if you will.
Null meaning
Yes, no, it's not the result of a user having said no. It's because it was never disclosed, but we have to write a 0 to that bit for consent. It has to be 0 or 1. Yeah, thank you.
That is sort of a side effect of our trying to accommodate the signaling for when it is okay to
use out of band.
Yes. But it also can be used by CMPs to make a decision whether or not in the global context to ask a user for consent for a vendor or a purpose that perhaps that user has previously rejected, stuff like that, right?
Yep.
We don't have that in service-specific consent, however, where the signal remains binary. Either you have consent or you don't have consent. You don't know why you don't have consent. We just know you don't have it. Or you don't know whether the user has objected to your processing on a legitimate interest, or whether the user has never seen transparency for your legitimate interest, because we thought in the weighing of the added weight and complexity of the string and the marginal benefit of knowing why you cannot process is not worth it.
I have a question about whether vendors will be able to register as processors, or does a vendor always need to be a controller? Is a vendor always a controller?
A TCF does not care about whether you are a processor or a controller. It is provided to vendors as is. It provides certain features, and vendors need to determine themselves whether, no matter what they are, it provides value they wish to leverage. So if you can see value in what the TCF provides as a processor, sign up. We don't care that you're a processor, and if you're a controller and you see value, then you should also sign up. Interesting for processors who may be working with other controllers who are signed up, perhaps the signal you're really looking at is the signal of your controller. Right? If you're working with a DSP and you are really a processor for that DSP, perhaps that DSP asks you to process on its behalf based on its signals. Maybe you're a controller and processor both, depending on the circumstance. So it's really difficult to give a general statement here. So we don't care. We leave that decision up to you.
I have a couple questions about Google's plans. So will Google get on board with the TCF version 2.0?
That's what they've said publicly. So there is, I think there is a number of stories in which Google spokespeople are quoted as confirming that they will join once version 2 is out. So they have been part of development of version 2, yeah. Both on the technical side and on the policy side. And so our hope, and based on their public statements, expectation would be that they will be joining whenever version 2 is ready and a reasonable amount of time has passed that allows them to make the necessary integrating steps.
Yeah, we have every expectation. There's a question about support for CMPs during the migration from TCF1 to TCF2. Are we going to provide supporting information? What kind of guidance and information, supplementary information, do we expect to provide to CMPs?
I think it's fair to say that we will have more webinars probably, or I mean, there will be more events for sharing information, for having Q&A sessions and so on, for one. But also, we're aiming at updating what is currently the implementation guidelines. I would like to refer to them as implementation manuals because they're really not optional. You ought to follow it, and so hopefully we will have much stronger documentation than we had in the past about what it is exactly that every part of the ecosystem needs to do. If you're a CMP, here is how you deal with version 2, and if you're a vendor, here is how you deal with version 2. So that's something we can unfortunately only publish sort of once the specs are final and we actually know what we are writing an implementation manual about. But that is in the plans.
Yeah, and in the spirit of the public comment period, where we definitely encourage you to send in suggestions for areas that you find are either confusing or that would benefit from use cases or examples. We'll take that very seriously and do our best to flesh those areas out so that's intelligible, more intelligible.
So I have a question about whether it's mandatory for publishers to use a CMP. Is that required?
It depends. If they wish to participate in the framework, the only way is to have a CMP. Now that might be a private CMP, which means the publisher is operating and registering its own operated CMP, or it finds what we call a commercial CMP, a CMP that is provided to publishers by companies as a service. But in order to plug into the framework, you need to have a CMP. We don't care who operates it, but you need to have a registered CMP.
So I have a question that may have been implicitly answered, but I have a question. Are SSBs supposed to accept both consent string versions 1 and 2 simultaneously? David, do you want to speak to that one?
I don't believe that there's any requirement of that. In fact, I believe some new entrants that are coming in version 2 may not accept version 1 strings even if they're being provided to them. So I think most of the vendors that are in it now will support version 1 strings if they're received up until the point that the TCF changes the policies and says that you should no longer receive them. I don't know if that answers the question, but
it's up to the vendors, basically.
It's up to the vendors, basically.
Here's a question from someone who obviously was aware of the pub vendors JSON route that we looked like going down before Christmas. So with pub vendors no longer supported, does this mean the version 2 string will support a filtered GVL writing global consent for those vendors?
I feel like there's a lot of things mixed up there.
There's a lot of things, maybe. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
So one, pubvendors.json was never formally part of the TCF. The policies have never required adherence to it. It was an optional specification. Pubvendors.json never had to do with global consent, and the GVL doesn't write the consent. So I'm not really following the question. It seems to be getting a few concepts mixed up.
Right. Okay. So here's a implementation question about vendors who may be missing. How can a CMP provide Facebook, Google Maps, Twitter if they're not registered vendors on the GVL?
So one of the things I mentioned in the very beginning is the point of the TCF is to provide an industry standard. An industry standard is great because you only need to implement the standard and hopefully you can play with all the actors in the industry. It would be great if in future Facebook, Google, and everybody else agreed to use this as a standard so that publishers don't have to deal with implementing different solutions for what is essentially the same thing. And that's why we have developed it. And it's a great example of the added cost that is created if industry does not back a single standard. Good news is that we do have one that is supported by a very large number of vendors already. And I think the more industry starts getting behind the TCF, the higher the pressure will be on those who thus far have decided not to integrate it, because the relative payoff and cost for them to join will be lower, and especially the payoff will be greater for for joining if, you know, most of their partners are working on the basis of it. It's a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, and there is the provision in the policies. A CMP may make disclosures for non TCF participants, but they have to they have to be very clear to the user that these are not TCF. These are not participants in the TCF and the rules and everything else. But it is allowed for a CMP to say, somehow allow the publisher to list some of those entities that you described, and then maybe query the CMP to say, what did the user say about those? But it would carry no weight or force other than on that publisher's site for the publisher to do something about it.
But we don't want publishers or CMPs to find solution for those vendors who are not part of the TCF. But the TCF just can't be the mechanism by which the relationship between a publisher and non-TCF vendors can be organized.
Right.
So, yeah, we're not getting in the way. We're offering a clear way forward.
So apropos of guidance, with so many new concepts being added to version 2, can the TCF provide user interface examples that meet UI, UX policies and guidelines? How far are we going to go in providing, you know, sample language, sample UIs? Are we gonna go there as the enforcement gets more detailed?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's a tough position to be in as essentially a standard setting body. I think one of the great advantages of the TCF is that it is not a tool, but that it is a framework that can be implemented differently by different actors, and where different actors can experiment with different ways of doing things that all meet the requirements of the policies and the law. And that competition will sort of help us find things that work and weed out things that don't work. The more we start providing examples or tightening the rules, the less scope there is for experimentation and finding that best thing. And sure, it might provide some more certainty for those who wish to implement. And I have mocked up things like, this is the way to do it. And I guarantee you those are not pretty. And you wouldn't want us to put out a mock-up that, you know, some lawyer at IAB Europe has drafted, because we are not user interface experts, rather we are not UI people. So I think we will want to continue to be really careful about providing examples of a UI simply in fear of that UI becoming something that everybody will start using, and what if we get something wrong, or if it could be done better. But what we will do is be really clear about what minimum criteria there are. And as Patrick has said, we will also be starting to check compliance with these requirements. And, you know, there will probably be certain things that every CMP will have to do, but there will be other things where CMPs can experiment and be free to try different things.
I have a question about whether, apropos of CMPs and compliance, if publishers don't implement a CMP, will the IAB Chrome validator, will the validator be able to read the site properly for consent? I guess that
no, if you don't use if you don't use the TCF, then we will detect that you're not using the TCF.
Yeah,
you're doing something else. We wish you luck with that. Hopefully, it's compliant.
That's right.
Let's see. I have a question about whether maybe for David, do DSPs, DMPs need to pass the IAB consent string, the TCF consent strings in sync requests?
That was another thing. Yes, they should. And in fact, we have an update. I believe last year we put out another OpenRTB sort of addendum that says, hey, here's the request parameter on the URL that one should append the two signals, GDPR applies and the consent string. There is another proposal coming out with B2 on getting the industry to standardize on some macros so that it's not specifying particular parameters, but just macros that everyone recognizes. But yes, long story short, they should be sending that along because they're going to need to know whether or not they have what we call purpose one device access permitted if the user is in the EU or GDPR applies. So yes, they should send it.
We have this question about whether there are any plans or what the plan is about reaching out to non-ad tech vendors. I think it's good to remind everybody that the TCF is not about ad tech only. It already, and has been since version 1, been supportive of other types of third-party technology vendors that are either similar or in the area of advertising. So measurement providers, viewability providers, dynamic content, you name it. Those are all vendors that can use the TCF already. Another thing is personalized content, content recommendation engines. All of these can already leverage the TCF. Moreover, I think we would be open to introducing additional purposes for categories of vendors who are currently not implementing the TCF. A very, very early version of the TCF actually had a social media purpose. But because Facebook or other social media players are not currently implementing the TCF, or were engaging with us about defining these purposes and standardizing them, we decided to axe that. I think to the extent that, for example, a standard purpose for social media buttons might be helpful, we would definitely be open to considering that and introducing it in future, because that is something where the TCF could very clearly, very easily add added value and bring more vendors into the fold. But the requirement sort of is for there to be demand for that, both from the publisher community and from the vendors who would ultimately be using it. There is very little point in us defining something that we don't know anything about, because those who actually need it aren't part of the conversation, or creating something that ultimately isn't used. But yeah, the TCF is very flexible and can be adapted also in future to encompass more people.
Down to the wire here.
Yeah, do we want to do like one more and then wrap it up, or?
Yeah, maybe one more. A perennial favorite. Many CMPs and publishers restrict the vendor list to just a limited number of selected vendors that they want to use. Does every CMP have to disclose all the vendors in any case, even if publishers want to restrict the vendor list? Are they obliged by the TCF to disclose all the vendors?
No, they're not. Every CMP must in principle be capable of working with any vendor. So CMPs may not say, if you work with me as a CMP, you don't have access to these number of vendors. But if a publisher only wishes to work and help establish transparency and legal bases for a subset of the vendor list, then they absolutely only need to provide transparency and obtain established legal bases on behalf of those vendors that the publisher has selected.
We got a lot more questions than we were able to manage orally here. And there was one question about whether we list out the answers to the rest of the questions. I think we can try to do that. We tried to do it. We did that last year during webinars we did for version 1. So if we can, if I can just freeze these and not lose them when we shut down the webinar, then we will indeed try to do that over the next few weeks.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthias, Tony, and all our wonderful speakers today. Thank you to all our attendees for being with us and for your sophisticated questions, I must say. We hope this session provided some clarifications on the content and objectives of the TCF version 2.0. As mentioned multiple times by our speakers, the public consultation remains open until May 25th. Please do submit feedback, comments, questions, and then for any additional questions or if you seek additional information, I will revert you to our website. Thank you very much and goodbye.